They retired on the same day, from the same school, the same profession, at the same age, and for years they had walked through the same hallways. That day, the teacher's lounge was more crowded than usual. There was a cake on the table, old photographs hanging on the walls. People were hugging each other and saying things like, "Enjoy your new life. You earn this." Someone was making coffee in the corner. Another teacher was joking about never having to set an alarm again. From the outside, it looked like a beautiful day. But that day, I felt something strange. Mr. Robin was smiling, shaking hands, thanking people, nodding politely. But every few seconds, the expression on his face would change, just for a moment, as if his mind kept drifting somewhere else. Then I looked at Mr. Walker, and he was incredibly calm, not excited, not emotional, just peaceful. And for some reason, when I looked at the two of them that day, it felt like they weren't walking toward the same future, even though both of them were retiring. And honestly, back then, I couldn't fully explain why I felt that way. But years later, I finally understood. Let me tell you a story. At that time, I was 40 years old, and for almost 10 years, I had been trying to build a different kind of future for myself, a quieter future, a life with more freedom over my time. That's why retirement never meant simply stopping work to me. I always saw it as something else, like slowly taking back control of your time. That day at school, I noticed something different for the first time. People could retire on the same day, but leave with completely different emotions. As the celebration continued, I kept finding myself watching them. Mr. Robin, Mr. Walker. They had both worked at the same school for years, drank coffee in the same teacher's lounge, walked the same hallways, dealt with the same students. But that day, they didn't carry the same feeling on their faces. And the strange part was this. I felt like I was the only person in the room noticing it. People were taking pictures, laughing, telling old stories. But I had started noticing different things. Even while Mr. Robin was talking, it felt like part of his mind was somewhere else. Sometimes he would drift off, then smile again and continue the conversation. Mr. Walker, on the other hand, was much calmer. There was a strong sense of peace on his face, like he no longer had to rush anywhere. He listened to people without hurrying, smiled quietly from time to time, and simply lived in the moment. That day, for the first time, I started thinking this. Maybe even if people work the same job, they don't arrive at the same future. And the strange thing was this. Both of them were retiring on the same day, leaving the same school, but they weren't carrying the same energy in the room. There was a slight exhaustion on Mr. Robin's face, like his mind was still thinking about tomorrow. Mr. Walker, meanwhile, looked like someone who had finally been able to stop. That was the day I started seeing retirement differently for the first time. At one point, another teacher walked over and hugged Mr. Walker. Laughing, said, "No more morning alarms, my friend." Mr. Walker smiled softly. "I think it'll take me some time to get used to it." But even while saying that, there was a deep sense of peace on his face. Then my eyes drifted back to Mr. Robin. Someone asked him, "So what are you going to do now?" Mr. Robin paused for a brief moment, then smiled. "I'll probably keep working for a while. Maybe part-time." He was still smiling when he said it, but for some reason the atmosphere in the room felt different for a second. Because just a few moments earlier, people had been talking about freedom. And now, during the very same retirement celebration, someone was talking about continuing to work. And at that moment, for the first time, I started wondering if retirement meant the same thing for everyone. The celebration continued. People took turns making speeches. Some shared old memories from school. Others laughed about how long they had all worked in the same building. One teacher joked, "One day it'll be our turn, too." Everyone laughed. But for some reason, that was the first day aging started to feel real to me. Because the people you see every single morning for years eventually disappear from your life for real. And life, whether you're ready or not, keeps moving forward. Toward the end of the celebration, people slowly started leaving. Pictures were taken, final coffees were finished, chairs were put away, and I looked at Mr. Robin and Mr. Walker one last time. That evening, when I got home, my mind was still at school. The house was quiet. Olivia was in the kitchen making herself some tea. When I walked in, she looked at my face, and I think she immediately realized something felt different. "How was it?" she asked. I placed my jacket on the chair, didn't answer for a few seconds, then quietly said, "It was interesting." Olivia smiled softly. "Interesting usually isn't a good sign," she said. I laughed a little, then walked toward the coffee machine. "It actually wasn't bad," I said. "Just thought-provoking." I poured myself some coffee and sat down by the kitchen table. 2 teachers retired today. Same age, same school, same profession. But all day long, I said, it felt like they weren't experiencing the same thing. Olivia listened quietly. One of them looked genuinely peaceful. The other one felt like his mind was still stuck in tomorrow. Olivia thought for a few seconds, then took a small sip of her tea and calmly said, "Maybe one of them waited for retirement, while the other one prepared for it." At that moment, I didn't say anything, because for the first time all day, someone had finally explained the feeling I couldn't put into words. That night, we sat in the kitchen for a long time, and without realizing it, the conversation slowly turned toward us, our own lives, our own future, because for years we had also been trying to build a different kind of life in our own way, a quieter life, a life with more freedom over our time. At one point, Olivia looked at me, then smiled softly. "You know, I think people assume retirement is about age. Maybe it's not about age. Maybe it's about whether you're ready or not." That night, we stayed in the kitchen for a long time, and honestly, after that retirement celebration at school, it was the first time we had talked about our future for that long. Eventually, the conversation drifted elsewhere. We talked about getting older, about time, about the things people postpone for years, plans people keep saving for one day. And I realized something. Most people seem to think retirement was just a natural part of life that somehow solved itself, as if, after working long enough, everything else would automatically fall into place. But what I saw at school that day made me feel something different, because even 2 people living inside the exact same system didn't seem to end up in the same place by the end of their lives. At one point, Olivia said, "Maybe people start thinking about the future too late." I nodded quietly, because I think that was the first day I started realizing retirement wasn't only a financial subject. It felt more like a lifestyle, something connected to how you live for years. And that night, while sitting in the kitchen, Mr. Robin and Mr. Walker were still on my mind. After a while, life returned to normal. School continued, mornings continued, the hallways, the bells, the students, the meetings. Everything kept moving exactly the same way. And then one day, completely unexpectedly, I saw Mr. Robin again. He was in an office, sitting behind a small desk. At first, I didn't recognize him, because in my mind, I was still used to seeing him in school hallways. But after a few seconds, when I looked at his face carefully, I recognized him. "Mr. Robin," I said. He looked up and smiled softly when he saw me. "Michael, good to see you." The room was lit by fluorescent lights. A few folders sat on the desk. There was a half-finished coffee in the corner, and honestly, seeing him there felt strange. He stood up. We shook hands, And for a few seconds, neither of us really knew what to say. Because when you're used to seeing someone in one place for years, seeing them inside a completely different life feels strange. "How's it going?" I asked. He nodded lightly. "Not bad. Calmer job. At this age, you don't really want to get exhausted anymore." He was smiling, but somehow there was a quiet tiredness behind that smile. At one point, he looked at the folders on the desk, then back at me. "I guess I couldn't sit at home too long," he said with a soft laugh. "It feels good to stay busy." I nodded, but in that moment, the retirement day at school came back into my mind, and honestly, while listening to him, I felt strange, because what he was saying and the expression on his face weren't telling the exact same story. He had said, "I couldn't sit at home too long. Staying active feels good," and he smiled while saying it. But in the way he looked at those folders, there was something else. He didn't look like someone who chose to keep working. He looked like someone who had to, and it felt like he was trying not to let me notice that. We talked a little longer about the old school, the students, the new teachers. Then I stood up to leave. Just as I reached the door, Mr. Robin called my name again. "Michael." I turned around. He paused for a second, then smiled softly. "The years go by fast," he said. I nodded quietly, and for some reason that sentence stayed in my mind for a long time. When I stepped outside the office, it was already getting dark. People were leaving work, some talking on the phone, others walking quickly through the streets. And I kept walking for a few minutes, but Mr. Robin was still on my mind, because the feeling I had years ago during that retirement celebration at school was starting to feel real for the first time, because the uneasiness I saw on his face that day was still there years later. And honestly, it started making me think, because Mr. Robin wasn't a bad person. He wasn't unsuccessful either. He had worked for years, fulfilled his responsibilities. But even after retirement, he was still sitting behind another desk. And for some reason, that image stayed with me. For a long time, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think the thing that affected me most was this. The peace I saw on Mr. Walker's face years ago, I had never once seen on Mr. Robin's. Back then, I couldn't fully explain it. But years later, I felt the exact same thing again. And then, sometime later, I saw Mr. Walker again, too. But this time, not in an office, in his backyard, with his grandchildren. It was a summer evening. The air was calm. Mr. Walker was sitting in a small garden chair. His grandchildren were running around the yard, laughing, telling each other stories. And honestly, the moment I saw him, I immediately remembered the retirement day at school years earlier, because the expression on his face was still the same. Calm, peaceful, unhurried. When he saw me, he raised his hand. "Michael, come sit." I sat beside him. We watched the children for a while, then he turned to me. "After a while, you start understanding the value of time differently." I nodded softly, because I knew exactly what he meant. There wasn't coffee on the table anymore. There was tea. There weren't folders in front of him. There were toys. And most importantly, he wasn't trying to rush anywhere anymore. "You know, Michael, years ago my wife used to tell me the same thing all the time. Put a little aside. You'll need it someday." He paused for a moment, then looked at the children and smiled softly. I'm glad I listened to her. Right then, the backyard gate opened. His wife walked outside carrying a small tray. She refreshed the tea, placed a few cookies beside us, then smiled softly. "Good thing one of us was thinking ahead," she said. We all laughed quietly. Then she sat beside me. "We were never rich people," she said, "but years ago we realized something. Relying only on a paycheck started making us uncomfortable." Mr. Walker nodded lightly. "So we started doing small things," he said. "A little saving, a little investing, living a little simpler. They weren't big things, but over the years, they change your life. That evening, when I got home, Olivia was in the kitchen again. This time she was making coffee. When I walked in, she looked at my face, then smiled softly. "I can tell," she said. "You're thinking again." I laughed quietly, then sat down. "I saw Mr. Walker today," I said. Olivia immediately remembered him. "The retired teacher?" she asked. I nodded. "I ran into Mr. Robin a while ago, too." I think today was the first time I really compared the two of them. Olivia listened quietly. "Mr. Robin was still working," I said. "But Mr. Walker—" I paused for a moment, then smiled softly. It felt like he had truly slowed down for the first time in years. Olivia took a small sip of her coffee, then calmly said, "Because one of them stopped when the time came. The other one couldn't." We sat in silence for a few seconds. Then, without even thinking, I said, "The strange part is, neither of them lived bad lives. They both worked for years. They were both responsible people. But years later, they didn't end up in the same place." Olivia nodded softly, then smiled. "By the way, I don't want to see you applying for jobs again during our retirement years." We both laughed. But honestly, in that moment, I felt a small sense of relief inside me, because for the first time, I could clearly see that the life we had been trying to build for years actually meant something in the real world. The next evening, after dinner, I felt like going for a walk. The air was calm. The streets were quiet. Every now and then, I could hear distant cars passing by. Some houses still had their lights on. And while walking, I found myself thinking again about the thing that hadn't left my mind for days. Mr. Robin, Mr. Walker. Both of them had worked for years. Both had spent most of their lives inside the same system. But now, looking back, it felt like they had been preparing for completely different futures all along. And I think that was the thing that affected me most, because people sometimes think about the future like it's some huge event waiting far away. But maybe the future is just the quiet accumulation of the small things people repeat every day. The way you live, the way you spend money, the things you postpone, the things you ignore. And years later, all those small things turn into something real in your life. Hello again, everyone. How are you guys doing? Before I end this episode, there's something I wanted to share with you tonight. While sitting here in the kitchen, I think after seeing Mr. Robin and Mr. Walker, I started thinking more deeply about retirement. Because honestly, for many years, I always saw retirement as something completely normal. People work, years pass, then one day they retire, and life keeps going. But over the last few days, I started realizing it might not be that simple. Because even two people retiring on the exact same day could end up living completely different lives years later. And that made me think, so I started reading more about this subject, about retirement systems. And honestly, the more I read, the more differently I started seeing things. Because for years, people were sold the same idea: work, pay into the system, wait patiently, and one day, the system will take care of you. For a long time, I believed that too, because everyone around me believed it. Teachers, bankers, government workers, neighbors. It felt like everyone was living the same kind of life. But then I started realizing something. Many of the systems we see as normal today were actually built for a completely different world, especially modern retirement systems. And while researching this, I learned something interesting. One of the first major examples of a modern retirement system was created in Germany in the 1880s by a statesman named Otto von Bismarck. And back then, people didn't live nearly as long as they do today. The system was designed for a completely different world. People had shorter lives. There were fewer retirees and far more workers. At one point in history, many people didn't even live long enough to reach retirement age. Today, people can spend 20 or even 25 years retired, but the system is still operating on the mathematics of the old world. There was a time when dozens of workers helped support one retiree. Today, in some countries, that number has dropped close to 2. And on top of that, people are no longer spending only 10 years in retirement. Sometimes they live another 20 or 25 years afterward. And honestly, I think this is the real issue many countries are facing today. Math. Because the system was built during a time when large working populations supported much smaller retired populations. But today, the number of workers is shrinking while the number of retirees keeps growing. And naturally, governments are starting to struggle. Some raise the retirement age. Some allow pensions to fall behind inflation. Others borrow more money. And in the middle of all that, many people still don't feel secure about their future, even after working for decades. And honestly, after reading all of this, I kept thinking about Mr. Robin again, because suddenly I realized something. Maybe a lot of people didn't actually do anything wrong. They simply trusted a system that had been built for a different world. That's why I never wanted to leave my entire future in the hands of a single system. Because systems can change. Rules can change. Money can lose value. But the things people slowly build for themselves over years can quietly keep growing stronger. And I'm not talking about luxury. I can't teach you how to become a millionaire, because I'm not that kind of person. But I can say this. A normal person making small but smart decisions consistently for 10 or 15 years can eventually gain more control over their time. Maybe one day, on a Tuesday morning at 11 a.m., you'll be sitting in a cafe without needing permission from anyone to be there. And honestly, I think freedom is sometimes exactly that. We'll talk more about these things in future episodes, but tonight, I just wanted to share a few thoughts that have been on my mind lately. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.